Hi, I'm Cory Barlog. I'm the director of God of War from Santa Monica Studio. I started out in film, and I went to school for directing, and the theme with my life is I'm extremely self-deprecating. I was a terrible film director in school, but I mean, I legitimately was. That's not even self-deprecating. That's just like honest analysis. I was terrible because I didn't understand it. Right? I understood the surface level. I was somebody who watched movies, who thought I understood movies because I watched movies, not because I really looked at what it takes to create an experience that you can follow, that you can relate to, that you can feel something about, right? And when I got out of school, I went into visual effects. So I worked on Mighty Joe Young and Inspector Gadget and Armageddon. And it was a very humbling experience to realize I don't want to work on visual effects. You're just making cool things happen on top of what's already happened. And it's frustrating because you're like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if you did this? Wouldn't it be cool if you did this? You want to be part of that, but it's like, no, that's the filmmaker. We're here on this end. We're making explosions and spaceships and stuff like that, and a monkey that walks around, right? And I realized, like, oh man, I don't know if I'm going to be happy doing this. And I was exceptionally disruptive, so much so that the president and the producer, the head producer and the president of the company, encouraged me to go over to games. Said I'd probably be happier doing that. I'd be happier being somewhere else because I was a giant pain in the ass to them. And I maintained being a pain in the ass throughout the rest of my career. It just sort of helped me because I ended up in places I wanted to be. And yeah, when I went over to games, I almost immediately felt like, wow, there's so much opportunity. I mean, when I worked on the film side, the guy who was the visual effects supervisor was like in his mid-50s, and he already won an Academy Award for Batman Returns. So I was like, okay, so I gotta wait till I'm like in my 50s to maybe be the visual effects supervisor. But even then, I'm not really controlling the overall experience. Control is a big part of my sort of pathology. I need to be in control of these things. So I was animating for a while in games and really honestly was gonna leave games. Like I was like, I really wanna make a movie because I feel like that's the only way I'm gonna be able to tell the stories that I wanna tell. I wanna do something that I wanna do. And same thing, I was just sharing my opinion constantly. I took the job on God of War 1 just so I could get money and then report for duty, not work late or anything. And I was gonna do another film. I was gonna start a film. And I would talk about it to Dave all the time. And I'd talk about the things we could do in the game and how, like, oh, did you see this thing they did in the Max Payne, in Max Payne 2 in the beginning with the hospital? I thought that was really cool. And I think through those communications, through those conversations, you sort of realize, like, hey, you should totally do this. So I sort of ended up in this job, not because I sought it, not because I campaigned for it, but because I wouldn't shut up. And I think that was the only way they could figure, like, he's never going to shut up, so just put him in charge so he can keep talking to other people. But I think, honestly, if I wasn't doing this, I'd probably be writing books. Even though nobody reads anymore, I like that freedom of actually writing a book where really there's nobody else you're answering to. It's your fault, or you did it, right? Like there's nobody else to blame, so you take out that stress level of the second half. It's like, I'm to blame if it's messed up, yes, but I sort of let down 300 people if I do that, whereas with the book, you let down like the 5 people who are going to read it anyway, so it's a smaller group. A lot of people had talked about, like, when you watch a movie, you're kind of going on a date, right? A movie is a singular experience. You go, you experience the movie, you take it in an hour and a half, or if it's a Marvel movie, 3 hours. You take it in, you leave, and you talk about it afterwards, right? But you don't keep going to that same movie, very rarely. Like some movies, you'll go see it over and over and over again. But it doesn't progress. A television show is kind of like inviting somebody in your house and sort of learning to know them, right? Getting to know them and spending time with them and over an extended period of time, so much so that you become connected to the characters much stronger. And I think with a video game, it's far more analogous to a television show in which you are creating a long-term relationship with this piece of content. But the interactive element, it adds that aspect that neither of the two passive industries have, which is, I am partaking in this, I am changing this. I am having an effect on it as it is having an effect on me. And I think the two-way street with video games creates this opportunity that when I was a kid, those connections, those sort of impactful moments were less sort of, mind-blowingly emotional, and they were far more just like, it stuck with you. It became this thing that you thought about over and over and over again, and you obsessed about it, and you were like, I gotta figure this out. And it became a puzzle. It became a part of your life, right? And I think now, there are these amazing experiences that are analogous to sort of a great television character, a great sort of arc within a novel or a comic book, but I'm part of it, right? I'm not just watching it, I'm actually in it, and I feel it changes from I saw this to I did this. And I think that's crazy. It's really cool. I mean, and we're only at the beginnings, right? I really feel like you look at film, was it like 1920-ish, right? It was around the time when sort of the film industry began. People started making silent films. And now here we are in 2019 and see where the film industry's at. We started, in the 70s, probably, really in earnest. We probably started in the 80s to really build up what the game industry was. I mean, we are very much at the beginning. We are very much figuring out what our footing is. And I feel like in 20 years, it's going to be crazy. I'm going to be way too old to be making games in 20 years. But what they're going to be doing with them is going to be unreal.
So we're going to have Kratos as a granddad. That's what you're saying?
Yeah.
There'll be another one. So given that your own journey in fatherhood has influenced this story, how much of you is in Kratos?
So much, yeah. I mean, it's never like a one-to-one analogy. I think with Kratos, you replace the rage with sort of obsessive nature, right? His obsessive nature happens to sort of manifest as rage. I have my own obsessive nature demons that I deal with, which interestingly also reflects a little bit in the story of, godhood for Kratos is this disease he's given to his kid, right? And he has to see that come out in ways that he doesn't know. So it's this sort of bomb waiting to go off, and he doesn't want to tell him about it, right? And I feel like I've done the same to my kid. I feel like genetically I've passed on this inability to let things go and over-focusing, hyper-focusing on things sometimes to the detriment of social relationships and ease of communication with other people. And I already see that as we were going through development. I mean, I see bits of those things popping up that I recognize, like, oh man, I'm like that a little bit. Ugh. And it's a tough thing when you actually see your worst qualities reflected back in your kids and realize that there isn't much you can do about that, right? You can help them to try to steer away from it, but it does feel very powerless, which is fascinating developing this game and seeing that same relationship of aspects of Kratos' past, aspects of Kratos' being manifesting in his son and feeling like, all right, well, no, you need to be better than me, right? And his kid's more conscious. My kid's only like 6.5, so me telling him to be better than me he's like, yeah, but I already am, right? So he doesn't really hear that clearly. I mean, everyone wants to tap into that frustration, right? Rage, anger. A lot of times in our playtests early on, we would hear from people, we would do a playtest of, a small level or a section or even just some combat. And you would hear a consistent theme in the feedback of people saying, oh, I had a bad day, right? And all they want to do was play God of War and just like stab a Cyclops in the eye or something like that. It was this sort of escapism where the main character really was devoid of kind of a moral judgment and compass, right? He was a pure vessel for rage, revenge, right? And I think vengeance and revenge stories resonate with people very strongly because we've all felt slighted at some point in life. We've all felt like powerless, and this allows us to, for just a little bit, take that power back, right? Feel strong. And I think in the beginning, it tapped into something. It was an anti-hero character. It was a very interestingly told vengeance story. And I think as we progressed on, we really didn't grow. That was a big thing that I was realizing. I was part of that not growing, and just kept hitting the same notes on the subsequent games. But I think everybody else was starting to grow, right? So that the change we made now is not only reflective of my own change, of the team's change, but I think of people in general's change, right? And I think we don't necessarily have to throw anything out. We don't necessarily have to pretend that the past didn't exist. I think it's a really, really interesting thing to show that we can have a past like his, but we can also progress forward. We can learn that there is a next step and a next step after that, as opposed to forget it, just wipe the slate clean and create a brand new character, which in some ways I guess that's easy, but life's messy, right? Sometimes you gotta figure out how to change yourself. Initially, I was thinking like, oh, you know what? We've put a lot of time into Kratos, right? So I would hate to feel like we didn't get anything for that. But I think that was just scratching the surface, really, as I started to dig into the story and wanted to understand what this was going to be all about, that I realized this is a huge opportunity. An opportunity that you don't usually get, because establishing backstory for a character is usually a little bit in the beginning or peppered throughout a journey. You kind of have to tell a story that's in the present, and then you have to tell the story that motivates who that person is to show how they're going to change. We have 7 stories, right, that basically allow us to build up this character as one thing, one anti-hero that everybody kind of doesn't like, right? He's kind of a jerk. And to be able to say, we're going to turn that around, and all of that stuff, you could have never played the games and still get a lot out of this, but if you've played the games, there's a tremendous turnaround for this person that is rare to get in most of these stories, because most people don't want to make that big of a change. So that was the early defenses of it, to say, once we realized this backstory for the character, this prologue, really helped show how he's going to change. And also, as I started to imagine it in the beginning, to say, you know what, if we didn't do Kratos, if we changed the protagonist, who would that be? And I started thinking about it, and what were the things that made God of War God of War? And Kratos really was the thing that made God of War God of War. Like, some people had told us, no, it's Greek mythology, but it really isn't, because there's so many mythologies on the planet, right? It was this very interesting character that nobody had seen before that sort of helped spark the fire of this in a way that's freeing. And I think I probably am one of the few people that would have been able to do it. And I don't mean like capable, I just mean like people would have bought it, right, initially. I think Jaffe or me would probably be the only people that they would say, oh, okay, you could change it, because it'd be too much of like, you're changing too much, right? But even saying that, there was a huge amount of you're changing too much. I mean, there was people on the team after a year and a half that were saying, I don't even recognize this anymore, it's not God of War. And then we released the E3 demo, and we were very polarizing. That people were supportive, but there was a lot of people that were hashtag not my God of Wars, you know, that were saying we're ruining it and we're doing it wrong. And, you know, I think for me, it was very freeing, because every time I finish something, I think of the 1,000 things that I did wrong, right? And I want to go back and fix all those things. But I don't ever want to do that. I don't ever want to go back and just change stuff and be like, I wish I would have, you know, put flashlights on the hands of the soldiers in E.T. And it's like, no, I don't really want to go back and actually change it. But how interesting to imagine what would happen if this person did change, right? Because that's really the essence of all character development in drama, is that the characters change. They evolve over time, right? Who they are is not who they become, right? Who they were is not who they are currently. All of these things are all about this trajectory of change. But for some reason, once we get comfortable in this idea of a franchise, people say, well, you can't change it, right? Like, I hope that maybe this spawns people's desire to really change a bunch of other characters. And I don't mean arbitrarily change them, I mean really look at who they are and go, where is an interesting way that nobody expects them to go? Or it's just gonna be a bunch of video game characters that have kids. And then there'll be all this series of video games characters, and they all have kids, and they all have a different, it'll be like the daddy daycare thing. That'd be fantastic.
If someone had told me that they were going to remake God of War and he was going to have a teenage son who was a little bit moody and hung around, I think I would have hated it.
Many did.
Well, that's what I'm saying is, you know, you clearly had to fight for Atreus, so why was he such an important part of this story?
Because Kratos has had such a history of really not caring about anybody. He's sort of had cinematic points where he's cared about his previous daughter, his wife, but they were all like backstory. They were information to fill in what's going on in the present, as opposed to forcing him to have to deal with somebody that isn't a conflict, in the traditional sense. It's not a conflict that he's used to, which is fists and swords, right? He can take care of people with those, but conflicts where they're mental, verbal, and sort of with his heart, and these are things that he's not comfortable dealing with. Atreus honestly could have been a boy or a girl. It was, if I had had a daughter, it probably would have been a girl. I think for me, it sort of worked out for him having a son, as he had a daughter before, and I didn't want to feel like we were playing on the same story beats that we had before, because we really over-focused, I think, on Calliope and his wife multiple times throughout the games, instead of really progressing him forward as a character. So Atreus was an important thing to push for, to show that he had to deal with these things at every second, right? That concept of, when you're a parent, you're not a parent from like 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. and then not a parent beyond that. It's all the time. It's all the time in your face. You don't get to take a break, right? And I think putting him in that situation, and putting him in a situation where he genuinely wants to figure out how to be better but doesn't know how to be better, is very interesting for characters, because it's like the reason you root for a character is not because they succeed, it's because they fail over and over and over and over again, but they get up each time, and you're like, oh, that's cool. I had a hard time in my life. I could do that too, right? You get inspired by people who fail well. The story has multiple lenses that you can view it through. It's the central concept of connecting with family. So this idea of Kratos raising his son really can be seen from, as a child, how I related to my father, right? Or how I related to my mother. And then as a father relating to my son. And I think this kind of universality of, we've all had complicated relationships with our parents at some point. We may not have tragic Greek tragedy sort of level relationships with our parents, but we've all had ups and downs, dips, right? And I think seeing even something that doesn't directly parallel your own life, but seeing the conflict and how they resolve this conflict of a character that you thought, hey, that's an irredeemable character, and they worked it out. Interesting. I had a lot of people come up to me in the last 6 months after the game released, and we're all talking about this concept of feeling like they understood their parents more because of this game, right? That they identified with Atreus strongly because their father was like Kratos, right? And it helped them understand their father a little bit more, which I thought was fascinating, right? And some of them felt like they actually reached out and talked to an estranged parent. And I thought, wow. I mean, you can't hope for something like that for a game, to actually be able to connect to people in such a way that it causes them to reach out and sort of mend things within their own life. I think that's amazing. We don't ever really aspire for that, but I think it's a pretty incredible thing to be able to do.
Did that kind of response feel intimidating?
It didn't at first, right away. It's more like, really? And then it's like, honestly, you go through the 5 stages of grief, right? You go through that denial, you're like, and then you get angry about it, and you're like, oh, no, don't do this, because now it's got to be better. You're going to expect something of me next time. Because in this one, it didn't feel like anybody expected much of us. It was a surprise. We were able to keep things back, and they didn't expect much. But now the next time, it's like, oh, it's built up. We really have to work harder until we get all the way back to acceptance, where it's like, all right, yeah, this is the challenge. This is what we do. But it chases you around. It's like when I directed God of War 2, the Ashes reveal moment was the thing that everybody asked me about. So they'd be like, what's your Ashes reveal moment? What's your Ashes reveal moment? And I was like, it didn't hit me at first, in the first 6 months of the project, that I didn't have that. I didn't have anything like that. And I realized, oh my gosh, he didn't engineer that moment to be the moment. It just happened to be. It's the same way that the blades, we didn't engineer it to be the moment. We wanted it to be cool and exciting, but it was maybe bigger than we had expected there. But I think when thinking about the ramifications of doing something good, is not what you think about right away. You think about, this is so great, I've wanted this for so long. And it, honestly, it doesn't, you're like, this is great, and eventually you realize, you kind of got to get to work, and I'm just going to focus on this, but then you can't stop thinking about, oh man, what if that's the best I ever do? I mean, honestly, we finished God of War 2, and Eric Williams, same guy, said to me, enjoy this, because we're never going to do anything any better. And I was like, oh, that's depressing, right? And he's like, no, it's just this is a fluke, right? And I was like, oh, okay. And then we did this one. And I was like, enjoy this.
It seems like there was a huge amount of trust in your vision. So how did you do that? Because that is not the video game way.
No, it's the Sony way though. That's what's really interesting, is that it is not common. I've been at a bunch of other companies and that level of trust is not really there. And I don't even know if it's lack of trust as much as everybody wants to be involved. You know, you'll get different people at different levels. Sometimes the GM that's like, I really fancy myself as a creative and I'd like to come in and tell you how to do this. And the worst thing is the devaluation of the concept of ideas. I've noticed a lot, like recently, people say, oh, everybody has ideas. Ideas are cheap, right? Which I think is a terrible thing to say. I think some people think what they're doing is supporting generally everybody who does work. And I think you can do both. You can say that the execution and the craft is exceptionally important. Having a great team is critical. A bad team doing a great idea, yes, it probably won't succeed, right? But having a great team and a great idea, these are very difficult things. And a great idea doesn't always feel like a great idea. Like that's the thing, is at the beginning of this, yeah, maybe, I don't know, this could be good, we don't know. And it is more just the lunacy of the individual who will just myopically push harder and harder towards something. Because the no camera cut thing, I knew in my mind, and I really believe, like, okay, if we could do this, it is matched up with this story perfectly. Instead of just saying, I'm going to do this no camera cuts and it's going to be a feat, and no, it'll be really cool that we did it, it's more like, no, this is about a story which you don't want to look away. It's an unflinching look, right, that sometimes is hard and sometimes is funny and sometimes is very sad. And we don't ever want to look away from that. But still, the amount of work that was slated to get that done, a lot of people were like, this is too much, right? But again, to Sony's credit, like executive-wise, like everybody else that was approving the project, no resistance whatsoever. It was always, whatever you're gonna do it. If the game was terrible when I showed it to them, they would say, this looks terrible, right? They're all pretty honest about that. But from a team perspective too, like that's the reason I like working with the group that I work with at Sony, is because they're not afraid to say this is bad. And I can discern between they're not comfortable doing the idea or it genuinely is a bad idea, right? So, yeah.
Are you ever nervous about asking people to have faith in something when they're saying to you, you know, okay, we don't really get this, we're not entirely sure what you're trying to do here, but...
I think when they put it like that, when they actually remind you that they're putting trust in you and if it's your call, it's usually when people remind you that, okay, fine, this is your choice, that you start to think, wait a minute. There was a point right before E3 where the tech director came in and told me not to talk about the no-cut camera. And I was like, well, why? And he's like, well, I don't know if we can do it yet. And I'm like, it's 2016. We have to do this, right? We're halfway through the game. Like, we can't take cut bait. And he's like, oh, I just don't talk about it because you don't want to be that guy who promises something that we can't deliver. And I was like, no, but we have to deliver this. And he's like, all right, fine, your call. And I'm just like, oh, was this a bad idea? It was like suddenly I was thinking, I'm pushing for this and I'm just so used to pushing for it that maybe this is a bad idea. But I feel like every sort of crazy idea you have that you think is going to be good, that's going to be hard to do, you go through that cycle of wondering whether or not it's good. And I think part of that cycle is the responsibility you have to, you know, we have 300 people on our team when we were finishing that game. That's 300 people I have a responsibility towards, right? That they're trusting me and I'm trusting them. And we have that two-way communication of they're providing something, I'm providing something, and we got to take a leap, each of us. And I think when it works, it's great. But it is very scary. Very, 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 very scary.
You talked about the no-cut camera earlier, and I think that's something that I'm super keen to delve into because it was just such a powerful choice. So where did the idea come from and why did you feel like that was the best way to tell this story?
I initially had been talking about this. I worked with a bunch of film directors after I left Sony in 2007, and you know, seeing so many of them become like film or game literate and want to get interested in games, and starting to realize like, okay, there's gonna be a lot more film directors coming into games, and they're gonna probably do a lot of these things that are really interesting, and then I'll feel like, well, we've been working in games for a while, and then they come in and they do it. So part of it was a competition, petty, I know. But the other part was, I really believed there could be something interesting for the complete commitment to it. Instead of just saying, oh, I'll do a single shot for one cinematic. It was like, what if it was literally from the menu to the end that we maintained a single seamless shot? And I'm like, that's really interesting, but that's crazy. Nobody's going to pay for that. And I had even pitched it on Tomb Raider when I was working on I was going to direct the sequel of that. And I was talking about it, and they kind of were like, what are you talking about? This is crazy. And they were right, because it didn't fit with the tone of the story. It wasn't really married perfectly for that. And it was like I was searching for this right fit. I knew it was an interesting idea, I just didn't know where it would fit. And when it came to this game, it was like, this is it, right? This is like, we're gonna take a game that traditionally had faraway cameras, where Kratos sometimes was a pixel on the screen, to show you the epicness of things. And I'm gonna take all that away, and we're gonna get really close to him, and we're never gonna look away. And every hard thing he has to deal with, you have to deal with. Everything he doesn't want to show you, you have to see, right? And I think that closeness and that sort of marriage of concept and actual sort of narrative execution is huge. Like, I don't know if it works, and I don't think it's a thing that maybe everybody will do, but I mean, I notice it a lot more now that we finished this game. So when I play other games and I'm seeing the cuts and I'm seeing loading screens and all this stuff, and I'm just like, oh, it's jarring, right? And it takes me out of that moment and makes me further realize that for that, it was definitely worth it. But the investment is huge, right? It's definitely something where you have to be willing to give up a bunch of other stuff so that people will believe in that. I mean, I have the games that continue to inspire me, games like Castlevania. You know, Castlevania Symphony of the Night remains this sort of perfect game for me. So many things that I've done throughout my career have kind of nodded back to that. Resident Evil 4 came out when we were working on God of War 2, I think, and that really fundamentally kind of like opened my eyes to, okay, they took a chance. They themselves, the director of Resident Evil was like, you can't have a controllable camera and have a horror game. It just doesn't work. You can't scare people then. And then he did it, right? So clearly it is possible. He took a really big chance. He changed the way that you consume that game, the way that you experience it, and it worked, and it was great. That's an inspiration. That whole story behind that is an inspiration. Some more recent games, I mean, you know, so many of my inspirational games are games that I played with when I was a kid. So Link to the Past, like played that on the NES. I played that, or no, sorry, SNES, and then GBA. I continue to play that game over and over and over again because it had so much of an impact on me on this concept of adventure, right? And adventure being something that is not just do this, it is the distance between I have to do this and I've arrived at this. The adventure's here, right? And I think so many people miss that. I think that's one really cool thing that we were able to do, is that everything happens on the road. Everything happens while they're on the move. They're always having developments of story and world building and character building, while at the same time experiencing all the different facets of gameplay. I'm a really big fan of adventure games as well. So Metal Gear Solid 2, played that one straight through, didn't sleep, was punch drunk from lack of sleep when he was doing that crazy stuff with like, you've been playing the game too long, turn it off. And I was like, what? It was so confusing, but really cool that a game could actually kind of mess with your mind a little bit like that, like Eternal Darkness. Really cool stuff with that. You know, Dark Souls 1, a lot of people talk about being influenced by that now, but it really is a singularly impressive feat to have somebody go, I'm going to do something that nobody does anymore, right? Very few games. Small, lower risk indie games will be like, I'm going to be brutally difficult, but fair, right? And the first Dark Souls or Demon Souls kind of bringing that concept in of like, I'm going to be obtuse, but everything's there. If you pay attention, if you work hard, you're going to have the satisfaction of beating this game. I am not that type of gamer, right? That is like, I love challenge. No, I'm not a challenge gamer. I'm an experienced gamer. I like to just enjoy the experience. I don't like to be punished, but I can appreciate the sort of subgenre that has been created out of this. And it's sort of a call to the past, right? When we grew up, Mega Man was considered like, it's not that bad. This is hard. You try to play that game now, it's punishing. Most games that we grew up on are punishing. Skate or Die, 720, all these games they're hard and they're supposed to be fun. But nowadays we would play test those and they would be much easier. So I think it's really cool that there's still this subgenre that actually embraces that, which is bringing about things like, permadeath, games like DayZ and other games which are like, we're gonna try something really bold. And it's harder to try that on a bigger budget game, right? Because there's more at risk. So you kind of have to hide those risks underneath the safe bets and say, see, this is totally fine, right? Like, I think most people didn't really get the implications of like a no-cut camera, so they didn't really view it as a risk outside of the studio. So it's easier to hide those risks. But I think if I were to say, I'm gonna have permadeath, and it's gonna be really hard, and it just feels like your audience keeps shrinking and shrinking. I think most people didn't predict that Dark Souls would have been as big as it was, but there is this contingent of players out there who want that satisfaction. They want that sense of accomplishment, which is awesome.
Well, speaking of brave decisions, Kratos has always been somebody that's had this hugely iconic weapon. So why this time did you go for an axe?
Well, it was interesting. The first drawing we ever did, we got from Jose Cabrera. That was the tone piece that we used for the remainder of the project. He did 2 drawings, and both of them had an axe in there. And when I gave him the descriptions of what the scene was and who was in it, I had said, for now we'll have him hold an axe. But if you have another idea for a weapon, that's great. I just don't want to dig too deep into the weapon at this point, because I felt like what we were going to do is have to really do a huge cross-section of, let's try this weapon. What about that weapon? What does that mean? And we'd be getting way too into it. And he drew the simplest, classic, Viking axe, which was just a stick of wood with the sort of beaten black iron head of it. And it just looks so interesting. I mean, it's so appealing to me right away to realize it's simple. I like that. And other people are like, oh, it's too simple. I was like, okay, well, we can make it a little bit less simple, but it's really interesting, right? There's something very sort of clean and simple about it, something that he would also do if he's choosing this, as opposed to the blades, which were not really a choice. They were sort of a pact that he made. This would be interesting that we didn't go too flashy. And then by the end, we end up going flashy because it's just so exciting to actually design more stuff for that. But I think that initial instinct of I really love this, right? It was, and it seems to happen a lot where we did a drawing of Atreus early on, and we couldn't decide on a hairstyle, so he was just bald. And I was like, ooh, I like that. And nobody else liked that. I was definitely on my own about that one. I was like, oh, it's like a little mini-me. And I eventually realized, okay, it looks weird. It doesn't work. But I held on to that for a while, even though I knew I was going to let it go, just to troll people on the team because it was fun. And Shannon had come to me and she was like, Barlog, we got to give the kids some hair. And I was like, all right, I feel like you're literally the last person in the studio to tell me this, so okay, I've gotten to everybody. I need to do this. So, yeah, the axe was, I think, just that great inspiration from the first drawing, but then it was that product of a lot of talented people getting their hands on it and making it even better and even better and even better. I mean, that's the best part about working with a team, is that everything does become better. And sometimes in the most unexpected and fantastic ways, if you're open to it. I mean, that's a huge part of this job, is to be open to what's happening and not necessarily say, okay, well, this is what I need, this is what I want. Okay, I can find a middle ground between those, that even though I don't necessarily want that, I feel like we can get something interesting out of it. I think some people are like, nope, it must be exactly like I'm saying, like this, and imagining that everything that they're saying is verbatim what it should be. And for me, I'm kind of like, look, there's a direction I need us to go in. And as long as we're not going that way, then we are going in the right direction. So let's explore what's inside of here, because there's got to be some interesting stuff that can actually make the idea of just an axe better.
Did you always know that the Blades of Chaos were coming back?
Yes. We knew that changing the camera meant changing the control scheme. And square, square, triangle is such an ingrained thing for God of War players that we realized that if we change the camera, we're going to have to move these things to the shoulders, because we want you to be able to control the camera at the same time that you're fighting. And it was like, all right, well, if you give them the old weapon, they're just going to keep trying going back to the old thing. And it was like, you watch it, when they got the weapon in the game, they do the classics, right? They go right back to their classic sort of combos. But they didn't do it on the face buttons because it had been so long trained on this control scheme. So we thought, all right, a new weapon forces them to actually learn everything new anyway, because they're not taking anything old in. They're not saying like, oh, it's a blade, so it should work like this. It's more like, oh, this is God of War, but whoa, this is all different. So they sort of take in new, and they learn the right way, which is our way to do it, as opposed to like, oh, it's the old way to do it. Because we offered that control scheme. We offered the face button mapping, because everybody kept saying, oh, I want classic control mapping. And 90% of the time, people would do it, play that way for like an hour or two, and then realize that this is better, right? Because we spent years finessing and figuring out that this actually is the best way to do it if you want to have control of the camera, because we wanted to be able to say, you need to be looking around a lot, right? That was a big part of the camera, was to say, it's not just going to be like a controllable camera, you need to be aware. Because the camera's in close, you don't get a freebie and just, oh, I get the view from Batman, which, awesome game, and really good for what they were doing to have that camera far back. You could see the whole battlefield. But for this one, it's like, I want you to be like Kratos, which means Kratos got to look around all the time, which means you're not necessarily always safe, right? So pushing that camera all the way in and forcing you to be a little bit more, scared, if you will, looking around and always being aware, like, all right, if I'm going to drive somebody into a wall, I need to stop and roll and then look back and see what's over there. And it was just forcing people in a different play style than perhaps they've been used to. And also, I wanted it to be an impact. I felt like the blades are charged emotionally with his sort of servitude to the gods and the fact that he made a bad deal with Ares, and it ended his life as he knows it and his family's life. And I felt like, okay, if ever he's going to pick those up again, he has to do it for a very important reason. And then he has to realize something about himself. Like, he has to get to that point and realize, like, I haven't grown as a person. I'm not a better person. I just realized that I am a monster. I'm just not going to do other people's bidding anymore. So therefore, I can accept, right? His first part is that acceptance, right? He's not reaching the end and saving the world. He's reaching the end and realizing he's imperfect, he's broken, and that he's making steps to be better.
I have to admit, I was incredibly sad that we never got to meet Faye. I mean, you made her sound kick-ass, and then, we didn't really get to interact with her. So why did you make that decision?
The story of Faye and Kratos meeting bears less weight when you already know everything, or when you don't know anything that's coming ahead, right? Meeting her needs to actually feel like something that you already know the story that we told here. So there's a greater weight behind who she is. She's got a mythology that's built up. So that first meeting and the period of time that they spend together, so much of it is not about fighting or action. That's the other tough part, is the work that he has to do is harder to do in a situation where you have to go into combat all the time around there, because they're both warriors who have reached a point in their life where they don't want to fight anymore, because they both see through the reasons of why they've been fighting. And meeting at that time, at that exact moment, when both of them are willing to set their weapons down, right, changes fundamentally both of them. And I think, because a lot of people say, oh, who do you identify with, what character in all of the games? And Faye was the one I identified with the most, right? Because I was not there a lot for my kid while he's growing up. I tried to be, but there's a lot of work going on. So I was kind of like Faye. And my wife is kind of like Kratos, going with our son, Atreus, on their journeys, right? And I'm just there occasionally being able to be part of that. And for me, I thought that was just as important, because it wasn't like I was not present at all or not wanting to be present, but things happen, right? And I think for her, I wanted to have a character that felt like there's a really strong reason for why they're doing it, but you get to know her throughout all of this, and you also get to understand that she has way more power than all of them. She is actually the controller of so much within this universe, so that way we build this up to when you actually do get to see this. And I don't know how we're going to tell this or when we're going to tell this, but I really want to tell that story of Kratos and Faye meeting.
So what was your favourite moment in God of War?
I think I mean, honestly, my favorite moments seem to be, I like to watch people experience moments in the game. There are several moments. The moment of saying goodbye to Faye and then realizing, spoilers, that Atreus is Loki. Like those two things, watching people experience those when they've never experienced it, so you get those sort of like let's play reactions, that's just magic, right? Because you're really catching them in these two very soft, beautiful moments and like a no way, right? You go in a span of like 2 minutes, you go from really like this felt good, the journey was complete. There's a sense of satisfaction, which as a creator, to feel like you reach the end and people are satisfied, they're like, that was great, right? I feel like that's hard to do. Endings are very hard. Game of Thrones will show you that people will petition that they don't like your ending. But, you know, I would say for me, being able to see those moments, because there's just too many that I like, and a lot of them that emotionally affect me, but being able to watch other people experience that is just like developer crack. It's so good. Yeah. Let's Play videos like that, we discovered those after E3 2016, and not like we're the ones that discovered them. At the studio, nobody was really watching those, and then a bunch of people started handing those around and saying, check this one out, check this one out. And then when the game came out, it was like we were consuming all of that. And it's like a playtest, honestly. It's like you get a playtest, but they react so much more. Like when we have playtesters who come in, you know, they're being paid, and sometimes they're tired, and most of them have no idea that they're being watched with a camera, so they just sit like that the whole time. And it's like, I want to see the reactions. I know how they play, and I'm like, oh, cool, I can understand that, but were they happy at the time? Were they sad? Were they frustrated? What's their face telling me? A lot of times it tells me nothing, but the Let's Plays are like, this is what I want people out of place. And I know they're performing for the camera, but still, it's amazing.
Were you surprised by just how successful God of War was?
Oh, it has been a surprise for me throughout the journey. I had an idea for this before I came back to Sony, but it was a surprise to actually have people embrace it and say, let's try this. There was some resistance, but I still think there was an idea that people wanted to support it, so I thought that was great. When we had to change everything in the first year, that was a surprise. Our first playtests were a tremendous surprise. They were not very good. It took a while for us to really get in the groove. I mean, even Shuhei famously was horrified by the game that he played early on. And then the release, I mean, honestly, as a lot of people say, oh, you had to have known. You really don't. Like, when you work on something for 5 years, you want to believe that it's good the same way you want to believe that your kids are really cute, right? But it's not everybody's kids are cute. So they're cute to you because they're your kids, but you have a very skewed perspective. And for me, I think as the team, there were 300 of us by the end of this, and we still felt, okay, we feel pretty good about this, but we felt good about other things before, so we don't know. It may work, it may not. Yeah, I think honestly this last year even has been a tremendous surprise.
So you famously left the God of War franchise. You know, you left Sony, you went on what you call the walkabout, which I love. So why did you leave, and what were you hoping to learn?
I had definitive proof that I was not very good, as I was working with a bunch of other people who, in a single conversation, would drop bits of knowledge about character and story development that I'd be like, it would blow my mind, and this was like basic stuff for them. And I was like, oh man, this is amazing. I really need to have more experiences. So I tried working with everybody that I could during that time to really glean all that I could, and probably my most rewarding time was with George Miller. I mean, I spent 2 years in a conference room with that guy just writing, and learned more in that time than I think I learned in all of my education and probably all of my time up to that point. That was kind of my awakening to realize, like, okay, I'm still not very good, but at least I understand why I'm not good, and I can start fixing all the things that I'm not good at and really focus on all the things that I've been missing. Because I feel while I was looking at story and character and game development in one way, it was like a blurry painting, right? It was like being up close to one of those, is it Matisse that does all the stipple? And you don't really know what the whole picture is. It's all blurry, it's all fuzzy. And as they started to explain certain things, as I started to work through certain problems in scripts with them, I realized, like, oh wow, oh, that's how that is. Like these little like pops of inspiration, pops of realization that like, oh, that's how that works. Oh, that's how that works. And it's an education you can't get anywhere else, right? It's in school, never would have gotten this, right? These are sort of these experts who are not trying to teach me anything. We're literally just trying to break a story, or we're just trying to work through a problem, and it is the way that they work through a problem. It is what they're actually saying while they're figuring it out that makes me go, oh my gosh, I've never even thought of it that way. And I think we watch movies, we watch television, we read books, we read comic books, and I think it gives us a bit of a false sense of understanding of everything. It makes us go, oh, well, I read books. Someone told me that they were a writer because they had written an email just yesterday. And I was like, oh, you're right. Like, you participate in the physical act of writing, but I think that's a vastly different thing than being a writer, right? And I think for me, I don't feel that I'm a writer. I'm still working my way towards actually being called just a writer at that lower level. I think it's this long journey of a lot of pain and a lot of self-deprecation, at least for me. But while I was at the tail end of that, I kind of realized, like, okay, I've learned a bunch of stuff. I need to make a game to test this out to see if I did learn anything. And I think my first thing was going to Tomb Raider, and I was going to direct the sequel. They were finishing up the first one, so I was going to go on and direct the sequel. And right when I got there, they were like, all right, we lost our cinematics lead, the director of cinematics, so can you just take over? And like, they had shot a bunch of stuff, but it was like all pieces on the floor. It was like a mess. So I was like, okay. So then I just worked for a year on that and realized, I think, in that year that if I was going to figure this out, if I was actually going to test this out, I needed to do something that I started. And if I was going to do the sequel, I'm sort of bound to what they had done. They did great stuff in that first one, so the second one needed to be kind of like a follow-up to that. And I wasn't really going to test out my skills if I just followed up a game. I needed to do something on my own. And I didn't think about Sony at first. It was Shannon who contacted me and said, hey, we're thinking about doing this. Ascension hadn't come out yet, but she's like, we want to try to mix up God of War. We're thinking about doing something different. And I was like, oh, really? Oh, I have an idea that's something different. And even at that time, it was only like a kernel of an idea. It wasn't really fully fleshed out. So we started talking for a little bit, and I was like, all right, I think this is it. Like, this is the thing. I'm going to leave Crystal, and I'll head over to Sony and start on this thing. Thinking, oh, I'll change a few things about God of War and maybe, try out a few things. And I think right when I got there, I was like, okay, we got to go completely different. We had 10 people, and almost right away I talked about Kratos having a son, and there was people like, why are we doing this? This is weird. Kratos has a kid. And Eric Williams, somebody who I've worked with for probably 15 years on everything I've worked on, he was the one that finally got everybody on board, where he just said, look, this is what it's about. Get on board so we can move on to the other things. And I was like, yeah, that's great. Because sometimes you got to have somebody who's just going to tell everybody that. Because when you say it, you're just being mean. But somebody else saying it, I can be like, yeah, how about that, right? He was a little mean, but you know what? He's right.
Something I'm really interested in is this idea that you're somebody who, as you said, you love control. You are somebody who is a storyteller with a strong vision. So how do you balance that with the technical aspects of making a game? Because you have to hand those over to somebody else. So how do you ensure the player is getting the experience you envisioned?
That is a very interesting question. It's a tough needle to thread with that, to be honest. Like sometimes the technical is a long time figuring out. Like when we were working on this game, we really didn't even have the engine figured out. We had a few pieces of it figured out, but everything was a challenge. So even just turning the lights on was a challenge. So therefore, getting to the really hard things like no-cut camera and an AI character who can do everything in the world, who can navigate and climb on your back and all this stuff, those seemed like insurmountable, insane challenges because we were still like, oh, well, we can't put lights in a scene. We can't string levels together and have them load from one to another. We didn't even have our loading scheme worked out. So it becomes this interesting thing with technical is that I just want to get in and solve the problems and talk about them and figure out how we're going to do this. But really it's sort of explaining what you want over and over and over and over again for several years until the technical people get to the point where they're like, okay, we're ready to do it now. because everything gets taken down to tiny little pieces of like, this is what we're talking about. Okay, cool. Let's talk about this one little piece. And when you're thinking about something so massive, right? Because even in the beginning, I was talking about the pitch for the game was very big, and I think part of me knew that it was big, but most of me was going like, don't worry about it. It's no big deal. It's only 10 hours. Don't worry. We're fine. It's gonna be like 15 hours. Don't worry. And constantly trying to calm people down simply because that's the only way I know to just have them move forward instead of focusing on the fact that, there's a lot of stuff and eventually we'll get to that, whether we got to get rid of it or not. And I think from a technical perspective, there's sometimes when I look at the schedule and they're like, we're working on the engine, and it's like a block of time for 2 years. I'm like, okay, so you're just working on the engine for 2 years. All right, great. But it is interesting to see how these things get stood up, because start to finish, really you're seeing the payoff way down here, like at 4 years. And those first 3 years, it's like you're just making stuff in videos and Maya, and you're talking about different features and, sort of checking in with people. It's like when we did the face scans of Sunny, who is Atreus in the game. This was the first time we were going to do full, it's called fax poses, which is all the different like movements of the face. And we were going to have stand-ins that were going to have generic faces, that we'd use all those. But then for Sunny, we were going to use his face in the game, and then we were going to scan all those poses. And I mean, he has to be able to hold like one eyebrow up and isolate a part of his lip and all this stuff. So they do like, 400 of these things. They put dots all over his face, and then they shoot 400 different, photographs of all the different angles, and then that translates into a 3D model, and then they clean all those 3D models up. That took 2 years. 2 full years of like when we talked about getting his face scanned to the point where he got his face scanned, and then actually seeing it hooked up on the rig in the game was like 2 years. Previous iterations, we get that done in a month, because we would have the rig and then you just animate. And this actually allows you to have greater fidelity that sort of matches. That's why Atreus' face, to me, always seemed to be perfect, because it was literally the kid's face being driven by him. The way we used to do it, the whole idea of kind of in a sound booth, and then we sort of added the tricks of like, two actors in a single sound booth, so they're playing off each other and you get a better performance. And then we had a little bit of times where we go on the mocap stage, but trying to get everything now on the mocap stage and really getting it all from the actors as they're performing with each other, that to me is more like what we should have always been doing. We just didn't have the technology, right? Because in the movies, you don't have like 5 actors in separate locations performing. They're all together. And that's how you're getting some of these performances that we remember. You're seeing it resonate and connect. And I think the added interactive element, I think, is sort of, it's transparent, it's invisible to the actors, like what they're doing. They don't really see a lot of that, and it isn't until we bring them in and we say like, here, check this out. And they're like, oh my gosh. Sonny was freaked out when he was like, oh my gosh, that's me, right? I don't think he even got it when we first cast him. So he realized like it was for a game. And then when we kind of brought him in for the callback, and then we brought him in to tell him he had gotten the part, he still hadn't really absorbed it. He's like, I don't get it. Wait, I'm going to be in a video game. That's crazy. And it took quite a while until like, I think E3, when he realized like all his friends coming up to him being like, oh my God, I saw you in that game. Where I think it's definitely, it's part of, I hope, many games right now pushing us forward in more of a, and I don't mean in the negative way. I think a lot of people look at it as mainstream and that's bad. But I think what's mainstream about it is it's showing like, my mother can look at this content and be like, oh, that's really cool. I can see there's a neat story there, versus, oh, that's just a video game, right? There's like, the dismissal seems to have ended, or at least shrunk. And we're getting a lot more people looking at this and going, wow, there's some amazing work that's being done here. Kojima with Norman Reedus and Mads Mikkelsen, like, that's, in some ways, that is bringing the audience is opening up the audience in such a major way, which is huge. I mean, for me, it's exciting because then we start to get better performers who really are excited about doing this. That's why I feel like we got lucky on this one, is that we have amazing performers who, even though they thought they were auditioning for like Game of Thrones or movies or something like that, when they were like, oh, it's a game, they weren't offended by that. They were like excited and like, this is great, it's a video game. And I think it helped open some of their eyes to realize like, oh, I thought video games were just in a sound booth and we just throw like, and screaming. Because that's like the worst case scenario for a voice actor, is like all the shouting and the screaming that they have to do, right? So I think it's very exciting now. Very exciting, like where we're going to be in 10 years, 15 years. How you doing holding that camera the whole time? I was gonna say, I am very impressed. That just means next time you're gonna have to do better.